On a snowy morning in Boston, a little girl sat shivering on the church steps, clutching a cracked lunchbox as if it were her only shield. Her lips were blue, her feet bare, and her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't leave me in the dark again." At that moment, a millionaire CEO froze. He had built towers of glass and steel, yet nothing had prepared him for the fragile child before him. This was not a business deal. This was not another merger. This was a cry from the shadows, a plea that would shatter his silence and pull him into a story he never expected to live. Stay with us, because what follows is not just about saving a child. It is about rediscovering light in the darkest places. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the Retold Stories, where every tale reminds us that love can change everything. The snow was falling in a hush that morning, soft enough to blanket Boston in silence, but heavy enough to blur the edges of the city. The streets looked less like streets and more like white corridors, leading nowhere in particular, muffling everything that moved through them. In the driver's seat of a black SUV, idling near street, Andrew's Church, Lucas Bennett, stared at nothing and everything at once. His hands rested on the steering wheel, rigid, as if he were bracing for an impact that would never come. The date carved itself into his memory every year, an anniversary that was less about candles or flowers and more about absence. It was the day when life had stopped making sense. His mansion in Beacon Hill was polished to perfection, but emptiness clung to its walls. Assistants decorated and redecorated, caterers delivered meals that cooled, untouched, and yet silence still reigned. Not gentle but punishing, like a presence pressing against him. He had convinced himself he was used to it, though he knew that was a lie. Silence was louder when it followed you from room to room and reminded you no one was coming home. He shifted his gaze toward the church. He hadn't crossed that threshold in more than 2 years. His wife's funeral had been the last time, the memory like a bruise that never healed. He adjusted his cuff as if that small act could pull him together, but then something outside pulled him away from his thoughts. At first, the figure on the church steps looked like a bundle of forgotten fabric left in the snow, but as the flurries slowed, the outline sharpened into something that made his chest tighten. A child. A little girl, so still she could have been carved from the very cold that surrounded her. His instincts split in two. One half told him to call someone, let others handle it. The other, deeper half, the part that still remembered what it was to care, forced him to act before logic could interfere. He opened the door, cold rushing in, sharp as broken glass. His shoes crunched across the snow as he approached. She did not flinch. Her bare feet were red and raw against the stone, her coat torn and barely clinging to her small frame. Against her chest, she clutched a cracked plastic lunchbox as if it were the only thing tethering her to this world. Her lips were tinged blue, and she shivered, not just from the cold, but from holding herself together. Lucas knelt, slowly, not wanting to spook her, and slid his coat from his shoulders onto her tiny body. His voice was careful, low, as though one wrong word could make her vanish. "Are you okay?" She reacted as though she had been struck. A sharp flinch, an instinct born of something far darker than winter. Her eyes rose at last, wide and glassy, and the words she whispered carried more weight than snow-laden rooftops. "Please, don't leave me in the dark again." Lucas froze, not from the air biting at his skin, but from the force of the plea. His heart, so carefully locked behind years of business meetings, headlines, and tailored routines, cracked wide open. He saw her cheeks raw from windburn, her thin hands trembling around that broken box, and when she let him unwrap the tissue she carried, the stale piece of bread inside looked more precious than gold. She had hidden it as treasure. His throat ached. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Bella," came the whisper, almost lost in the wind. Her words stumbled forward, each one pulling Lucas deeper into a reality he hadn't expected. She was alone. Her mother had died when she was born. Her father had disappeared soon after, and now she lived with a woman named Diane who told her she was a reminder of loss. A child forced to carry blame too heavy for grown shoulders. If she did not bring food, Diane locked her away in a closet with no light, no windows, a dungeon disguised as discipline. Lucas could barely breathe. He tightened his coat around Bella's shoulders, offering warmth that felt like nothing against years of cold she had known. "Come on," he said gently. She stood, uncertain but obedient, leaving small bare prints in the snow as she followed him. Inside a nearby cafe, warmth rushed at them in a wave, though Bella did not seem to feel it. She clutched her lunchbox, wary of every glance. Lucas ordered cocoa, sandwiches, soup, gentle foods that could not harm. She stared at the cup before daring a sip, and when she did, her eyes widened as if warmth itself were a surprise. His phone buzzed insistently on the table, reminders, texts, the pulse of the empire he had built. Without hesitation, he silenced it, turning it face down. For the first time in years, he cared more about the small child across from him than about meetings or contracts. When he asked about her family, she spoke with a kind of quiet acceptance that shook him. "Mommy died when I came out. Daddy left. Miss Diane says I'm just a reminder." Lucas clenched his jaw, rage building where sorrow once lived. She spoke of the closet as though it were routine, not punishment. She even produced a drawing, crumpled and worn, of a box filled with scribbles of darkness, a girl curled up inside, and a lock overhead. Lucas studied the image, his heart splintering. "She must never put you there again," he said, his voice firm. Bella studied him back, then asked, "Is your house dark too?" The question pierced deeper than she could ever know. He thought of the echoing hallways, the half-empty bed, the silence that followed him like a shadow. "Yes," he admitted. "It island." She tilted her head, then nodded, as if his confession made perfect sense. Hours later, he guided her into his car, her tiny frame wrapped in borrowed blankets. She stared out the window silently, her cracked lunchbox in her lap like armor. Lucas felt the weight of her trust pressing down heavier than any contract he had ever signed. By the time they reached the hospital, his decision was made. This child was not going back into shadows, not while he could stand in the way. When the nurse asked how long she had been in the cold, he could only shake his head. Too long. The bruises along her arms and legs told the truth he did not want to speak. Rachel Monroe from the Department of Children and Families arrived, her calm authority filling the hallway. Protocol dictated emergency foster care, but Bella's wide eyes clung to Lucas with something more than fear. They clung with belief. "She trusts me," Lucas said, his voice unshakable. "I'm not letting her vanish into another dark room. If there's a way for me to take her in, I'll do it." In that sterile hospital corridor, with fluorescent lights humming above and the echoes of children crying behind thin curtains, Lucas felt something stir in him that had been buried since the funeral. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a choice. To step back into life, not for himself, but for this little girl who had whispered a plea too raw to ignore. He had once built skyscrapers and companies. Now he would build something else. Safety. Home. Light. For Bella. And in doing so, maybe for himself too. Bella did not speak much in the hours after the hospital, but her silence was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of waiting, of testing the edges of trust. Lucas noticed it in the way she watched everything around her, her eyes darting like small birds. When he led her into his penthouse for the first time, she paused just past the threshold. The ceiling stretched high above her. The city glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, yet she stood as if the walls might close in at any second. The marble floors gleamed, but her bare feet curled against the rug near the door, hesitant to claim space. Lucas had lived here for years, and yet he had never truly seen how cold it looked until that moment, a mausoleum of stone and glass meant to impress, but not to shelter. And now, in contrast with this fragile child who carried bruises beneath her sleeves and guarded a broken lunchbox like treasure, it felt obscene. He realized with startling clarity that wealth could decorate, but it could not warm. He moved gently, speaking in tones softer than he was used to, offering her juice, crackers, a blanket. She clung to his coat, unwilling to shed the one piece of safety she recognized. He let her be. Instead of pressing, he searched for something he had never typed into his computer before. Nightlights for children afraid of the dark. Hundreds of images filled the screen. Stars, moons, animals glowing gently. He lingered on one shaped like a soft yellow star. Something about its glow reminded him of the way Bella had whispered about finding her way out of the dark. Without hesitation, he ordered it for same-day delivery. Later that night, when the package arrived, he opened it as if it were fragile glass. He carried Bella to the guest room he had hastily prepared, placing the star-shaped nightlight near the bed. The glow spilled across the walls, not harsh, but tender, enough to push the shadows back without overwhelming. Bella blinked sleepily at the small light. "Is this mine?" she whispered. Lucas crouched beside her bed, his heart tight. "It's your room while you're here," he replied. She studied the glowing star and murmured, "She can't get me if Star's watching." Lucas stayed on the floor until her eyes drifted closed, her hand clutching a stuffed owl the hospital had given her. For the first time in years, he stayed awake, not to escape silence, but to guard someone else's dreams. In the days that followed, small changes began to ripple through the penthouse. The quiet that had once been suffocating shifted into something alive. It started with the sound of crayons scratching across paper, the kind of sound no interior designer could plan for. Bella spread drawings across the coffee table, crookedly taping them to the fridge. A stick figure standing under a glowing dot she called Starry, a house beneath a smiling Sunday. And sometimes, darker ones, a closet drawn in thick black lines, though even those began to show cracks of light pushing through. Lucas, who had once filled walls with curated art worth millions, found himself smiling at the uneven lines and smudged colors of these new masterpieces. One afternoon, he pulled a roll of blue painter's tape from a drawer and declared the refrigerator their official art wall. Bella's eyes lit up, and for the first time, he saw a smile that was not cautious, but full. Rachel Monroe visited for a home inspection, her expression carefully professional, but her eyes softened when she saw Bella leading her toward the guest room filled with fairy lights and taped drawings. "She didn't speak at the shelter," Rachel admitted later, in a quiet voice. "Not once. We thought trauma had silenced her." Lucas didn't reply. He simply glanced toward the hallway where Bella's laughter had just echoed. Rachel smiled gently. "You've given her something most cannot. Safety." Lucas shook his head. "All I gave her was a room and a nightlight." But Rachel corrected him softly. "And you stayed, yet safety was fragile." Late one evening, Rachel returned with files that made Lucas's chest burn with anger. Diane Ford had filed forged documents, planning to move Bella across state lines, vanishing into a system easy to manipulate. She had even requested an appeal to challenge Bella's emergency placement. The thought of Bella being torn away made Lucas's pulse thunder in his ears. He had built skyscrapers and commanded boardrooms, but never had he felt such urgency, such terror of losing something before it had fully taken root. He hired the best child advocacy lawyer in Massachusetts, gathering every piece of evidence, photos of bruises, Bella's drawings of the closet, witness statements from hospital staff. Still, when the apartment grew quiet at night, fear crept back. Lucas would stand in the hallway outside Bella's room, watching the glow of the star-shaped nightlight push back shadows and wonder if it would be enough. Bella herself seemed to sense the tension. One night, Lucas found her sitting inside his guest closet, knees pulled tight to her chest. Owie the stuffed owl clutched so hard her knuckles turned white. His breath caught. "Bella, why are you in here?" She looked up, her voice quiet but steady. "I wanted to see if I was still scared." He knelt, heart breaking at her words. "Why would you do that?" Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell, because sometimes the bad things come back, even when it's warm. Lucas reached for her, but stopped short, his throat tight. "You don't have to go back," he said firmly. "Not ever. Not if I can help it." She hesitated, then whispered, "She said you'd get tired of me." Lucas's chest ached. He cupped her small shoulders gently. "Bella, you don't get tired of people you love." She leaned into him then, fragile, but trusting, and he held her as if letting go would undo everything they had built. The day of the custody hearing arrived with pale winter sunlight spilling over the courthouse steps. Lucas had walked into countless rooms of power in his life, but this was different. This was not about profit margins or investors. This was about a little girl who had whispered in the snow that she was afraid of the dark. Bella sat beside him on the bench, her feet swinging above the floor, Owie in her lap. Across the aisle sat Diane Ford, her sharp suit a poor disguise for the coldness in her eyes. Her attorney spoke with polished detachment, painting Bella as a troubled child prone to fantasy. Lucas's jaw tightened until it ached. When it was his turn, he rose slowly, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not here because of wealth," he said. "I'm here because no child should have to beg not to be left in the dark." And then Bella spoke. Her small figure barely visible behind the podium, she lifted her chin and said with quiet strength, "Mr. Lucas gave me waffles and a nightlight. He doesn't get mad when I forget things. He told me the dark doesn't get to win, and I believe him." The room stilled. Even the judge's weary eyes softened. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. When the gavel came down, granting permanent guardianship to Lucas Bennett, Bella leaned against him and whispered, "Did we win?" His voice trembled as he smiled. "Yes, Bella, we did." When the gavel struck, something inside Lucas shifted. For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest lighten. Not completely, but enough to breathe differently. He and Bella walked out of the courthouse together, her small hand tucked inside his. Snow flurried lightly in the air, soft enough to feel almost celebratory. Bella lifted her face toward the sky, catching flakes on her nose, and whispered, "Does this mean I never have to go back?" Lucas squeezed her hand gently, bending low enough for her to hear his. "Reply clearly. It means you're home now, Bella. With me. Forever." She nodded once, as though sealing a pact, and for the first time he saw her walk without glancing back. That evening, the penthouse no longer felt like a stage set for investors. It felt lived in. Bella rushed into her new room, her arms stretched out as though claiming the air itself. The walls, once bare, now shimmered, with fairy lights and shelves filled with books and stuffed animals. She spun once, laughing, and said, "It smells like warm." Lucas stood in the doorway, watching. The phrase was strange, but it struck him deeper than any polished speech he had ever given. He whispered to himself, "Welcome home, Bella." The words tasted like truth. He had not realized until then how much he needed to say them. Days began to unfold differently. Morning used to mean stale silence, the faint echo of his own footsteps. Now it carried the soft shuffle of slippered feet and the melody of Bella humming while she colored at the kitchen table. He once measured life by quarterly earnings. Now he measured it by the crooked drawings taped to the refrigerator and the way Bella's laughter echoed down the hall. On weekends, they painted together walls, stars, sometimes even each other by accident. Bella insisted on a midnight blue wall in her bedroom, dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars they placed side by side. She held up the largest one proudly. "This one's you," she declared. "The big star that stays on all night, even if you turn the lights off." Lucas lifted her onto his shoulders so she could press it firmly above her bed. He looked up at her and felt something bloom in his chest, fragile and fierce at the same time. At night, Bella no longer begged him to keep doors open out of fear. She asked instead because she liked the way the light spilled across the floor. He would watch her drift into sleep, Owie the stuffed owl tucked beneath her chin, the glow of the star-shaped nightlight washing over her face. And though grief still curled around the edges of his heart, memories of Claire, of what had been lost, he realized he no longer lived inside that grief. It did not own him anymore. Bella's presence had changed the silence. Where once it was hollow, now it was full of breath, of crayons scratching, of whispered questions that made him smile in the dark. One afternoon, he watched Bella at the community center just a few blocks away. He had donated to the place for years without ever setting foot inside. But now he stood in the back of a reading room, arms folded, while Bella sat cross-legged with younger children around her. She held a book in her lap, stumbling only once on a word before correcting herself with determination. When one boy flinched at a sudden sound in the hallway, Bella leaned close and whispered, "It's okay." The dark lies. It says you're alone, but you're not. Lucas's throat tightened as he watched her press a small glow in the dark star into the boy's hand. "Keep it in your pocket," she told him. "That way the dark never wins." Lucas felt his vision blur. Bella wasn't just healing. She was sharing the very light she had fought so hard to find. But healing is not a straight path. There were nights when Lucas woke to find Bella standing silently in the hallway, eyes wide as though listening for something that wasn't there. Sometimes she checked closets, testing them, as if daring the darkness to return. Each time, Lucas knelt beside her, patient, reminding her that no one would ever lock her away again. Slowly, the tremors faded. She began to believe him not just because he said the words, but because he kept showing up. Day after day, night after night, he was there. And each time she leaned into him, each time she called him simply Dad without hesitation, Lucas felt the layers of his old life fall away. The empire he had built no longer defined him. What defined him now was the small girl who painted stars on his walls and laughter back into his life. One morning, sunlight streamed across the kitchen, landing directly on a drawing taped to the fridge. It was a picture Bella had drawn herself. A tall man with square shoulders, a little girl with curly hair, and a smiling owl above them. Above it, in crooked letters, were two words, "Our home." The light hit it like a spotlight, and Lucas paused mid-motion, orange juice half poured. He stared at it, unable to move. Bella padded into the kitchen, her pajamas covered in tiny moons. "Good morning," she mumbled sleepily, then saw where his eyes rested. "The sun likes it," she said, smiling. Lucas crouched beside her, pulling her close. "So do I." In the evenings, they sat together by the window, looking out over the city that once felt indifferent and cold. Bella would point at the tallest buildings, asking which ones he had built, then giggle and declare hers was better, the one with stars taped to the walls and a fridge full of drawings. Lucas laughed, realizing she was right. Towers of steel and glass could impress, but they could not embrace. They could not whisper good night or fill silence with humming. They could not draw stars. Only she could. As weeks turned into months, the darkness that had once consumed both their lives became something different. It wasn't gone. Shadows always linger, but it no longer won. Lucas realized that healing didn't mean forgetting loss. It meant allowing love to carve space alongside it. And Bella, who had once whispered her fear of being left alone in the dark, now fell asleep beneath constellations they had painted together, surrounded by warmth she had helped create. Lucas would stand in the doorway some nights, watching her small chest rise and fall in steady rhythm. He remembered the girl on the church steps, clutching a broken lunchbox, whispering not to be left in the dark. And then he looked at her now, safe, beneath a Pradat sky of painted stars, her hand curled loosely around Owie, and he knew with absolute certainty that the dark had lost. There are stories that move quietly, like whispers through the cracks of our lives. And then there are stories that crash into us with the force of a storm, changing everything we thought we knew. Bella's story is one of those. A little girl, no older than 6, sitting on the frozen steps of a church, clutching a broken lunchbox, whispering words no child should ever have to say. "Please, don't leave me in the dark again." That plea, born of fear and silence, reached a man who thought his heart had been buried with the past. Lucas Bennett had built towers of steel, commanded rooms full of power, and lived in a house that glittered but felt empty, yet none of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was a child who had forgotten what safety felt like. Their journey together was not easy, healing never island. There were nights when closets still loomed like monsters, when Bella's voice trembled with memories of hunger and punishment, when Lucas wondered if love alone could protect her from a world that had already taken too much. But night after night he showed up. He brought her cocoa instead of silence, crayons instead of fear, light instead of darkness. And Bella, brave beyond measure, began to believe. She began to laugh, to draw, to hum, to trust. She turned her fear into stars on a wall, and into tiny plastic gifts she gave to other children, whispering, "The dark doesn't win." And in saving her, Lucas was saved too. The silence that once punished him became a silence filled with warmth of footsteps, padding down hallways, of paper taped crookedly to the fridge, of a child calling him Dad, with the kind of faith that could rebuild a broken man. Loss would always be a part of his story, but it was no longer the ending. Bella had rewritten it, turning grief into love and shadows into light. We tell stories like this, not because they are easy to hear, but because they remind us of something vital, that even in our darkest nights, light waits. Sometimes it takes the form of a star-shaped nightlight. Sometimes it's a hand that doesn't let go. Sometimes it's a promise, whispered at the edge of sleep. You don't have to be afraid anymore. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you of your own light, the one you can hold for yourself or share with someone else who needs it. And if you believe, like we do, that stories have the power to heal, inspire, and change lives, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Retold Stories for more tales that stir the soul and remind us that even when the dark feels endless, it never wins, not as long as love stays.